Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 568. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy Macpherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, Robert, you ready to do this?
Sure, let's get it done.
All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Robert Macpherson. Robert, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So Robert was a career infantry officer in the U.S. Marines with service in Vietnam, Iraq, and Somalia. After retiring as a colonel, he enjoyed a second career with the humanitarian organization CARE. Now, Robert is a mental health advocate, particularly for humanitarian aid workers and those who work on the front lines. After Robert was diagnosed with PTSD, he received a gift. He reached out to the Southeastern Guide Dogs in Florida and was partnered with Blue. Robert and Blue will be featured in the cover story, America's Best Pet Pals, a Reader's Digest October issue based on an essay Robert wrote about Blue. Robert, welcome. Thanks for joining me, man, today.
Thanks again.
All right. So, let's start here. Military, you get out, humanitarian aid worker. Talk to us about this transition.
When I went to Somalia in 1991, and at that time it was called Restore Hope, my job was to coordinate this massive amount of military assets with the need to end the starvation. That was our mission. It was not make war. It was to end this starvation and assist the UN and the humanitarian community. Well, I was tasked to coordinate all that, and it struck me when I got there that I had seen a lot of combat. I realized that generally in those situations, people got out of the way, civilians. It wasn't they weren't around, but and we were cautious with civilians, but most of them were gone. This was my first time I ever walked into watching so much devastation going on, watching starvation being used as a weapon of war, and for the first time, coming face to face with starving people. I've seen hungry people. Many Americans have seen hungry people. Seldom have you seen starving people. And that impacted me, really impacted
me. How long had you been in the military by this point?
By that time, about 29, maybe 28 and a half years.
So a while.
Yeah, a while. Yeah, I had been in the Marines for quite a while.
But are you saying it wasn't until this experience that something clicked for you?
I can't say that. Certainly, as we get into the elements of PTSD or my beginning, that certainly warfare is the foundation, I think, of where this started. But it was generally, think about the Marines. You know, they're first in. It's pretty desperate. They arrive and they are warriors. And this is a combatant. You meet that combatant and you make war. Mm-hmm. Think about Somalia. It was entirely different. It may have been America's first truly humanitarian effort where they brought 50,000 people to the stage to try and end this starvation. Meanwhile, there was a side to get these warlords in line. But our greatest, and mine in particular, my greatest effort was to move those assets of trucks, helicopters, medicine, food, you name it, to coordinate that with the humanitarian community and again the UN to get it out there to save lives. And every day that brought me face to face with situations where you thought to yourself, this is impossible. How can many of these people still be alive? That's how malnourished they were.
Yeah. I mean, I don't pretend to understand any of that and just understand the experience.
Well, thank God you don't, because
Yeah.
it's remarkable.
You talked about your experience with PTSD. With all due respect, can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Anybody who has PTSD, you can't help but wonder what happened. Where did this come from? Because in media, and even when you're going through therapy with other people, they can fix an incident. They can say, many of the Vietnam veterans I associated with can say, well, in this one event is when it happened. Guy, I think in my case, by staying in the Marines and I hope I can pull this out just right, where I was with a group of people who had suffered the same things I had, who had seen the same things I had. And I hope this makes sense. You're with this group where you don't need to talk about it, explain it. It's just, we were all there in one way or another together. And I think that helped. It might not have been therapy, but I think just being inside that form's not the right word, but that structure helped. It wasn't until I got out that I began to think, whoa, I'm having a pretty hard time adjusting to this other life. And the way I did it was to recreate it. Look, I truly believe in aid work, and I believe in humanitarianism, and I am an advocate for human rights. But I also realized that what happened to me was that by going back to these different complex environments, as strange as this sounds, I felt more comfortable in those. I knew what to do. I just knew how to handle it. It was the other side, like most people are living, where I had problems adjusting. Guy, does that make sense?
It does. It makes a lot of sense. It's on one sense, it's, I don't know. I can't think of another word, but it's sad to hear that, we don't create, or we haven't yet created a safe way to transition our warriors.
Yeah.
Such that they have to feel in order for them to feel comfortable, they have to go back or recreate like you did.
And that was it. Now, I will say they do a much better job now with the veterans, particularly from Afghanistan and Iraq, than they did, if you will, in my era. But it's still, that transition is hard. And I cannot begin to tell you how alone you feel. And that just adds to it, doesn't it? I mean, you begin to isolate more and more. And because you just know something's wrong. And yeah.
So walk us through, Bob, what happened? I mean, when you got out, how did you begin the second career?
Well, back to Somalia, when I was in Somalia, the president and CEO of CARE had been seconded by the United Nations to oversee the entire humanitarian effort in Somalia. Well, you can imagine I worked with him 12, 14, 16, 20 hours a day for months and months and months. We became close friends. Plus, prior to my deployment to Somalia, I had already, between an unaccompanied tour in the Far East for 13 months, going to Desert Storm in Iraq, I already had nearly 29 months of unaccompanied tours behind me. I was coming up on 30 years as a Marine, which is a magic number for retirement. And I thought, okay, I've had enough of the deployments and all those things. So this man, Phil Johnston, said, "What are you going to do when you retire?" And I said, "Look, I live in Hawaii. I'm going to read, I'm going to write, and I'm going to hang out at the beach. That's my entire focus for the rest of my life." So about 2 months later, the Bosnian War was going pretty heavy. And he called and said, "How's all that reading and writing and beaching going?" And I, "What do you want?" So I went to Bosnia to do some work for them. And one thing led to another.
Okay. And what role did you move into?
In Bosnia.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went to, I jumped right in. I went to Sarajevo, and there was, in fact, I've written about her. There's a wonderful, just unbelievable, great woman I worked with who really was overseeing all the humanitarian efforts in Sarajevo, because if you recall, at the time it was cut off from the rest of Bosnia with snipers and being surrounded. And there was some aid getting through, but she just needed some help.
Mm-hmm.
And she needed some help from someone that CARE felt could handle the complexity of that environment. So that's what we did. We got aid in, and we delivered it in the middle of that chaos. And to give credit where credit is really due. So you're talking about a couple of North Americans. She was from Canada. But the people who were really doing the work were the men and women of Bosnia, particularly in Sarajevo. So it might have been us with the face of CARE at that time, but the people who were out really struggling, getting injured and worse, were the people of that city trying to assist, other folks in the city. It was a pretty dramatic time.
And just for those listeners, briefly explain what CARE, the organization, does.
Oh, CARE is at one time, and if it's not, it's still up in the top few. It was the largest secular humanitarian, if you will, aid agency in the world. And CARE still does two things. They do humanitarian work, and there's a precise definition to that. That is what I do. That's the aid work that is done in the middle of the complexities of natural disasters, wars. Think about New Orleans right now, or Haiti that just had another earthquake. So you have all this devastation. People need to go in and help. There's the other side for the development side. For instance, CARE has probably been in India helping for over 70 years, helping to build the infrastructure of a nation or a region, primarily a nation. So I'm reaching for this, but they're probably in 70 plus nations around the world assisting with that development work. And as these different emergencies pop up, that's where people who do what I did go to assist.
Now, how did you find your role as a mental health advocate for humanitarian aid crisis workers?
Wow, Guy, that's the question. So don't let me climb on a soapbox too high with this. It came about and I can identify when this happened. I had a colleague who was the country director. In other words, she was a development worker in Iraq. And she, about 30 years earlier, she was from Ireland and I think dual nationalities, Great Britain and Irish. But she had met an Iraqi airline pilot when he was sent to Oxford or someplace. And anyhow, they fell in love, got married, and went back to Iraq. So she worked in Iraq under Saddam. And just through the force of her willpower and strength, but the fact that she began to be viewed as an Iraqi, she actually handled all of CARE's work in Iraq at that time to help build it. Well, she's a strong-willed woman, and I can't say that we had a lot of affection for each other, but we did respect one another. Well, Margaret Hassan, after Saddam was kicked out, and she began to rebuild in that society. But if you recall, just the structure of the society began to collapse as different ethnic groups, cultural groups began to fight with one another. Long and short of it is, Margaret was kidnapped, and I was asked to go in to work with the British government to help get her release. And we worked at that for 2 months, and that didn't happen. She was killed. And it was pretty graphic, the way they took her life. And that was, I think that was my final straw. I think it started in the Marines. I handled it. I think by going to these different places, I was handling it. But there was just something to the innocence of this person who'd done nothing in her life other than try to assist other humans. And her life was taken away. And because I was such an integral part of trying to gain her release, that was my tipping point. Mm. That's I can identify that now as that was it for me. That was the last straw. I can't say I went immediately into therapy. That took some time, and unfortunately too much time, but that was my tip. Yeah.
Oh, what a story. Now, the book that you've recently written or recently came out, Stewards of Humanity, Lighting the Darkness in Humanitarian Crisis. This is a result, I'm guessing, of what? A lot of experiences that you've had?
Yeah, it was, it started actually in the Bosnian War and went through Afghanistan. And it, Guy, when I finally went into therapy, I turned to the only place I could, and that was the VA. And they welcomed me with open arms. In the bad rep they get on some things, treatment of PTSD is not one of them. They know what they're doing, and it saved my life. Oh. But I began to realize how many people I knew in the aid industry who had no place to go. Particularly if you think about just the way business, any business in the West works now. It's founded a lot on consultants. So, and it's the same in the aid community. So you get a consultant, she or he go off to these places. Generally, they can be quite young, but when that contract's over, they may be living in Minneapolis by themselves. They really don't have a place to turn. I did. So in the book, I believe now, looking back, and a lot of this is looking back, the book was therapeutic. I wanted to recognize a group of people I saw do extraordinary things. You know, in the military, they give you a medal. You know, they'll have a parade. They will give you a medal. They will acknowledge that this contribution was above and beyond. It's not always war. It can just be doing an exceptionally good job at something. People in the aid industry, thank you very much. That might be it. So I wanted to write about that. I also found, and this was after the fact, I got concerned one day and I thought, well, how does this book lay out gender-wise? This is, this was in one of the drafts. And I went back and I looked and I thought, okay, I'm happy with that. Then I looked at it with national versus international staff. Am I just going to write about people who look like me, some white guy? And it wasn't. I felt a nice balance with national versus international staff. But wrapping all that together in this underlying, I was writing this book when I went into therapy. I thought, wait a minute, what are we doing here? And I had written an article for a medical journal talking about the forgotten first responders, because we talk about police, soldiers, firemen, people working in hospitals. And then I thought, there's this other group out there that do remarkable things for the good of mankind. We don't think about them a lot. So I hope, that's kind of a flow of how many of these things came together.
I appreciate you sharing that. So in our remaining few minutes here, who is the book for?
Wow. Hey, Guy, you got me on that one. I thought I'd been asked every question for. You know what this book is for? This book is for people to read and say a couple things to themselves. One, who are these aid workers? Let me read about them. Who are these people that go out and do these things? And second, what happens to them? And and maybe third is we have a tendency to think, again, I bring this back, that, they come from Europe or they come from North America, because that's who you see, isn't it? On the donor things on TV and the rest of it. It's always people who look like us assisting people who don't. And that's not the case. There are 70% of the aid workers are people who, are from their own country, trying to do this work to assist others. So who's this book for? I'd like to educate people on several levels about aid workers, about PTSD, but particularly PTSD in the aid community.
Once again, speaking with Robert Macpherson. The book is Stewards of Humanity, Lighting the Darkness in Humanitarian Crisis. Yeah, I really appreciate, Robert, how, you shared your own experience in the military and with PTSD, and walked us through, in a sense, how things unfolded such that you're advocating, you're writing about and for this group of people who, you're right, we don't have them on the checklist, right, of the first responders, but right. Like you said, they're doing amazing work. I really want to thank you for jumping on here. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
The easiest way would be through my email,
okay.
RSM Robert Seamus Macpherson. You'll like that. So RSM at Robert Seamus Macpherson, and that would be Seamus, SEAMUS, Macpherson spelled MACPHERSON, just like you.
Okay. Got it. I'll have it linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com.
Thank you.
You are welcome. I'm excited to get this out there. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And thank you for your service. Incredible service.
Thank you very much.
All right. Take care, sir.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.